Hi all, welcome. We'll just wait for maybe a minute or two for everyone to log in. Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening from Los Angeles. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to panel 6 of the webinar series, Historicizing Disaster Risk Management, the Ecology of Monte Sarog and its Environs. I am Stephen Acabado, Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA. Before we start, I would like to recognize that as a land-grant institution, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. This webinar series is a product of collaboration among various institutions, including the Partido State University, the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, the Center for Taiwan Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies, or CITIPILS, at the National Tsinghua University, Taiwan, and the Program for Early Modern Southeast Asia, or PEMSEA, which is a partnership among the University of Hawaii Manoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Department of Anthropology, University of Washington, and the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. PEMSEA is supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation and various UCLA units. This series is supported by the Philippine Commission on Higher Education and the UCLA Cochin Institute of Archaeology and the UCLA Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. Panel 6 of this series discusses Southeast Asian archaeology in the US. I would like to thank the panelists and the moderators for their generosity. I know they're all busy, but they have agreed to share their time to participate in this panel. And let me play a pre-recorded video to introduce our panelists and moderators.
Panel 6, entitled The Future of Southeast Asian Archaeology in the U.S., is composed of 6 panelists and 2 moderators, all from the United States. Our first panelist is Professor Alison Kyra Carter from the University of Oregon. Professor Carter is an assistant professor in the anthropology department at the University of Oregon. She received her PhD in 2013 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her dissertation research focused on the compositional analysis and study of stone and glass beads and their exchange at proto-historic sites in Cambodia and Thailand. In addition to continuing studies of stone and glass beads, her current research focuses on the excavation of residential areas dating to the Angkor period, both within Angkor's capital and its provinces. She has received funding for her research from the ACLS Lutz Foundation, National Geographic, and the Earthwatch Institute, among others, and her work has been published in such journals such as Science Advances, PNAS, Cambridge Archaeological Journal, and the Journal of Field Archaeology. She has undertaken archaeological fieldwork and research in Cambodia since 2005 and Thailand since 2007, and studied the Khmer language since 2006. Also joining our set of panelists is Professor Nam C. Kim from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Kim is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is an anthropological archaeologist interested in early cities, practices of violence and warfare, and the relationship between modern politics, cultural heritage, and the material record. Since 2005, he has been conducting archaeological fieldwork in Vietnam at the Kolua settlement. Situated near modern-day Hanoi, Kolua is connected to legendary accounts and the genesis of Vietnamese civilization and is viewed as a national cultural symbol. Kolua is also significant as it constitutes one of the earliest cases for state formation and urbanism in Southeast Asia. Professor Kim is the author of several peer-reviewed articles in English and Vietnamese and chapters as well as monographs on ancient Vietnam and the origins of warfare. Another member of the panel is Professor Mitch Hendrickson from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Hendrickson is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He also serves as an adjunct curator at the Field Museum of Natural History. His research interests focus on the role of craft technologies and transportation systems in the rise of pre-modern states, specifically in the Angkorean Khmer Empire in Cambodia. He currently directs two multidisciplinary international projects based at the site of Preakan of Componsai and the metallurgical landscape surrounding Nomdek. Beyond addressing the research requirements of his governmental and private funding sources, a recurring goal is the democratizing of archaeological approaches for the field and lab contexts. Also one of the panelists is Professor Pival Heng from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Professor Heng is an ACLS Robert H. N. Ho postdoctoral fellow and graduate faculty scholar at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and Department of Anthropology, Northern Illinois University. He received his PhD degree in anthropology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he is currently an affiliate graduate faculty. Professor Heng's archaeological research themes include religious change, urbanism, settlement patterns, landscape, political economy, socio-political organizational shift, and heritage studies. He is also interested in the intersection between heritage management, collaborative public archaeology, knowledge production, and urban development. His current project explores the transformation of urban and rural settlements in response to the demographic and political changes that took place with the adoption of Theravada Buddhism in Angkor. Also joining panel 6 is Professor Ben Marwick from the University of Washington at Seattle. Professor Marwick is an associate professor of archaeology in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Geoarchaeology Laboratory at the University of Washington in Seattle. His current research combines models from evolutionary ecology with analysis of archaeological evidence to investigate past human behavior. Specific interests include hominin dispersals into mainland Southeast Asia, Pleistocene technologies and ecology in Australia, mainland Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Professor Marwick works on techniques and methods for reproducible and transparent research and open science in archaeology and related fields. He has current research collaborations in Vietnam and Myanmar. His work has been funded by the Australian Research Council, Wenner-Gren, the National Geographic Society, and the ACLS Luz Foundation. His research has been published in Nature, Science, and a variety of peer-reviewed international archaeology journals. Our last panelist is Professor Stephen Acabado from the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Acabado is Associate Professor of Anthropology and a member of the core faculty of the Codson Institute of Archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the newly appointed Director of the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. His archaeological investigations in Ifugao, northern Philippines have established the recent origins of the Cordillera Rice Terraces, which were once known to be at least 2,000 years old. Professor Acabado directs the Bicol and Ifugao archaeological projects and co-directs the Taiwan Indigenous Landscape and History Project. He is a strong advocate of an engaged archaeology where descendant communities are involved in the research process. The moderators for Panel 6 are Professor Miriam T. Stark from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Professor Peter V. Lathe from the University of Washington. Professor Stark, Professor Anthropology, University of Hawaii at Manoa, Hawaii, has co-directed field-based archaeological projects across Cambodia for nearly 25 years in collaboration with Cambodia's Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts and APSARA Authority. Her archaeological projects blend research with capacity building for Khmer archaeologists and include heritage management in their long-term research designs. She also directs the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and serves as PI for the newly funded UHM East-West Center Loose Sea Transitions Project to support collaboration and capacity building and research on agrarian and rural transitions in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Professor Peter V. Lathe is an archaeologist specializing in the histories of social change in the island Southeast Asia over the last 4,000 years. His research focuses on island landscapes and seascapes, cross-cultural interactions such as trade and warfare, human-environment dynamics, and climate change. He has conducted collaborative fieldworks in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Philippines. He also has an interest in archaeological practice, museums, and heritage management in the Southeast Asia and the US, and has ongoing collaborations with Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest of the US. A virtual round of applause, please, for the Panel 6 panelists and moderators.
Okay, now I turn over the virtual floor to Dr. Stark and Dr. Lathe.
Thank you, Dr. Acabado. So Miriam and I are going to share moderating duties. So we're going to go back and forth. And I did want to mention one change. One of our panelists couldn't attend tonight. So there's 5 of us. Mitch Hendrickson from University of Illinois, Chicago is out sick. So sad to miss him, but we have a great remaining group of panelists to answer our questions tonight. So we'll start with a little bit more introduction. Each of the panelists will just briefly introduce themselves and share a little bit about what they're doing recently and some of their significant activities or projects as an archaeologist. So I'm going to ask Dr. Acabado to start that.
Share my screen. Okay, that should be okay. Thank you. So my research continues to engage archaeological issues that focus on colonialism, culture contact, and indigenous empowerment. Although the bulk of this research has emphasized the unique responses of the Ifugao I have to colonialism in the Philippines. I have recently expanded my investigations of Iberian colonialism in Asia, by theorizing how Filipino groups responded and co-opted the colonial aims. This work contributes to a better understanding of the early modern period in Southeast Asia, a region that played a major role in the rise of European mercantilism in the 17th century. The current direction of my various research projects converges in the EMP, the early modern period in Southeast Asia and Taiwan, which was characterized by major climatic fluctuations that had immense impacts on political patterns in the region. The period also saw European expansionism and subsequent resource extraction that shaped and continues to shape present-day environmental and social dynamics in Southeast Asia. Although these historical events are known, there is a dearth of work that synthesizes and integrates investigations focused on the EMP, and this is basically what the Lucy-funded project is aiming to achieve. In a chapter that I co-wrote with Dr. Ellen Xie of the National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, we identified three major themes that illustrate work on the historical archaeology in East and Southeast Asia, focus on trade ports, colonial communities, and indigenous communities. We argue that these themes, if intensified, would bring historical archaeology of East and Southeast Asia in the global discussions of European colonialism and move forward Southeast Asian archaeology, not just in the US, but globally. I continue to conduct fieldwork in Ifugao, Philippines as part of the Ifugao Archaeological Project. Recently, I have launched a new project, the Bicol Archaeological Project, which aims to compare lowland responses to colonialism with those that we have documented in Ifugao. In addition, I am also involved in the Taiwan Indigenous History and Landscape Project, a collaborative research program that involves the Tayal, a Taiwanese indigenous group, the National Tsinghua University, and the National Taiwan University. I am particularly gratified with our community collaboration as the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, based in Ifugao, has spearheaded a call for the involvement of and participation of stakeholders in the site excavations. And I aim to use the same strategy, engagement strategy that we did, we rolled out in Ifugao to bring in communities, Southeast Asian communities in Southern California to our projects here at UCLA. Thank you, that's mine.
Thank you. Next, Alison Carter, could you take the next one?
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to participate in this panel. I don't have anything as nicely prepared as Dr. Acabado, but I am dropping in the chat a link to the project website for the current project that I'm working on and co-directing with Miriam Stark, one of the panel moderators. The most recent work that I've been a part of in the past few years has been working with Miriam and also with other panel member Pipal Heng, looking at residential areas around Angkor and Siem Reap in Cambodia, dating to sites, occupation areas dating to the Angkorian period, and especially focusing on those within temple enclosures. We've had several publications come out about that work in the past few years, and with more being planned. However, in 2018, we shifted our project to move to Battambang province, just across the lake, the Tonle Sap Lake, and are investigating similar questions at a provincial site just outside of Battambang town, the capital of Battambang province, a little temple called Prasat Pasait, which you can see behind me in my Zoom background. And we've been looking there also at occupation areas in partnership with Earthwatch. We were looking at occupation areas around the small temple. Of course, that has been put on hold due to COVID, but we are hoping that we can get back and continue this work and looking more at the kind of dynamics between residents and this provincial site and their relationship with the Angkorian capital. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. All right, next in alphabetical order, I'm just going around here. Pipal Heng.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. The introduction video earlier already outlined what I have done so far. And also from Alison's what we have done in Angkor as part of the greater Angkor project. My personal interest is archaeology of religious change. That is one, and then I am interested in looking at the relationship between religious change and social organizational shift. Using example from Cambodia, my doctoral dissertation at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, I looked at the transition into the pre-Angkorian period using excavated data and survey data from Thala Boriwat, located along the Mekong River in northeastern Cambodia. And my current postdoctoral project, also as part of the Greater Angkor project and the ACLS Robert H. N. Ho family program in Buddhist studies, I look at the transition from the Angkor period, pre-modern Cambodia, to the post-Angkorian period, early modern Cambodia, using an archaeology of religious change from Hinduism to Buddhism, and how that impact settlement pattern, both in rural and urban landscape in Angkor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Nam Kim.
Thank you. Let me share this slide here. And as my fellow panelists have pointed out, the earlier video montage was quite beautifully done and offered much more detail than I could hope to have done. But I'll just sort of complement the information that was given. And I also would like to thank PEMSEA and Dr. Acabado for the honor of being part of this panel this evening. So my interests in archaeology range from early urbanism, complex societies, how power and political centralization relate to changes in the ancient past, and how all of those material records also connect to modern day identity and communities. I've done collaborative fieldwork in Vietnam for about 15 years now, and I'm hoping to continue doing some of the work in Asia in other areas, including South Korea, moving forward. And I can talk a little bit more about that as the panel goes on. But my recent work has been at this Skoloa settlement, which is located outside of the modern day capital of Hanoi in the northern part of the country. And it is one of the largest prehistoric settlements located in Southeast Asia. The collaborative fieldwork I've been working on with colleagues in Vietnam has been focused on trying to answer various questions about the emergence of the site and the kinds of conditions under which the settlement emerges. A lot of the work has been involved with excavations, increasingly with remote sensing, since it's such a massive site and we don't have access to all of the areas for intensive excavation. But our questions range from the conditions as well as the sort of ecological impact that these communities might have had on the surrounding environments. We've partnered with various institutions in Vietnam. Much of our work was supported by the local governments as well as the national government. And I would note that the site itself is very prominent in Vietnamese historical narratives as well as in the national imagination. It's tied to folk tales and legendary accounts, and it prompted a lot of interest, political interest, on the part of the government with our fieldwork. So we had from the former president, for instance, visiting our site, the deputy prime minister and others. And on that image on the right, you can see even today, there are school field trips that come because the historical texts talk about this site and its connections to Vietnamese early history. And so I think you can see their kids are making the outlines of the rampart walls of Goloa as part of their exercise on this field trip. But I'd be happy to talk more about all of these issues moving forward during the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Right, and then turning it last to Ben Marwick.
Thanks very much, Peter, and just want to echo what Nam was saying. What a great honor and pleasure it is to be here amongst some of my very favorite archaeologists that I've known really since the beginning of my career. So it's super fun and a real privilege, to be here with you all. So yes, I mostly work at a much earlier time period than my colleagues here. The hunter-gatherer cultures into the Ice Age between sort of 5 and 50,000 years ago is kind of my focal point. And I'm especially interested in people, the first appearance of people in the mainland Southeast Asian region, and the kind of stone artifact technologies that they use to get by and move around the place and eventually get to Australia. And so my current interests kind of span from Southwest China right into Australia, and really focusing on Southeast Asia to see like what was going on in that part of this kind of great movement of people across the globe. And so places where I'm interested in, especially and active. So Thailand is where I started with my PhD. Indonesia recently, and most currently active with colleagues in Myanmar at the Field School of Archaeology in PA, and this is them in this photo here. And sadly, many of them have archaeologists not very active in Myanmar at the moment since the military coup, and many archaeologists have fled their place of work for fear of their lives. But I'll talk more about this later. And also active in Vietnam, in northern Vietnam, working with colleagues at the Institute of Archaeology on a couple of really exciting rock shelters, and we've got some really exciting dates of some stone artifacts from there that we're working on publication of right now that really helping me to address some of these issues about humans moving into the region, some of the first people on the landscape. So that's what I'm up to. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, everyone. So Miriam, I'm going to turn it over to you for our first questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening, this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are. I'm Miriam Stark. It's a real privilege to be here with all these wonderful people. And we'll try to get to your questions at the end, but we wanted to start really by situating Southeast Asian archaeology in the United States and asking how Southeast Asian archaeology is represented or underrepresented here in the United States where we all work. I'm going to open this up and ask for volunteers to answer this question. Nam.
Thank you, Miriam. Well, I guess I would start by saying that I'll just talk about my own personal experience going back to when I first started as a graduate student in the United States. So back in the early 2000s, when I was thinking about possible areas to work in, it was suggested to me to look at Southeast Asia, and in particular, it was suggested to look at Vietnam. And one of the things that I noted at the time was when I was trying to find potential researchers to contact in the United States who do or did archaeological work in Vietnam, I couldn't find very many. In fact, I probably can count on my one hand how many might have done. Dr. Acabado is holding up 3 fingers. That sounds about right for early 2000s. And I think, to illustrate, even when I was in grad school, I remember going to the SAAs, the Society for American Archaeology, and maybe you would see one panel that had any Southeast Asian papers, but it was generally clumped together with other papers from Asia altogether. But the situation has changed dramatically since then. This panel is a testament to that. All of the sorts of support and efforts and energy by visionary policies and programs from folks like the Luce Foundation have really revolutionized the scene. I'm thinking, of course, about all of the positions that were created over the last decade or so, including my own, and all of the changes that have happened in terms of collaboration between countries, including the United States. So to me, that's a sort of general representation of what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years or so. So in terms of representation, the situation has improved dramatically. I would say there's still a lot of work left to be done, and I would defer here to comments from my colleagues as well. But I think as the discussion goes, I'm sure there are other areas we can talk about where that representation can still be improved.
Thanks, Nam. I wonder, since you mentioned the importance of the loose program in East and Southeast Asian early history and archaeology, whether we might turn to Ben Marwick, who also has something probably to say about this question.
Yes, thanks, Miriam. And like Nam, I'm also, my career was launched in Southeast Asian archaeology by the Loose Foundation, thanks to the grant that Peter Lathe wrote that funded the first few years of my faculty position, and also a bunch of other things at the UW, including PhD scholarships and some field schools that Peter Lathe and I were able to run in various parts of the region. And they really, the field, so obviously the position for me was pivotal. I may not have stayed in archaeology if I hadn't, this job hadn't become available, but the field school was really an important thing as well, because that allowed me to continue being active in the region, to spend time there, and to bring undergraduate students and graduate TA from the United States, people who might not otherwise ever have gone there, and then provide opportunities to continue for them to be engaged in Southeast Asian studies, doing lab work, following up from the field work, and so on. So the sort of multi-dimensional elements of the loose support have been really vital in maintaining the representation of Southeast Asian archaeology, not just in like a class on the time schedule, but opportunities for the students to sort of fulfill their undergraduate degree requirements and maybe have a study abroad kind of adventure as well, whilst kind of gaining knowledge and skills and understanding about Southeast Asian archaeology and culture. So yeah, really been a tremendous, the loose support has been tremendous for my career, especially, as Nam mentioned as well. Thanks.
Peter, did you want to take over?
Sure. Maybe why don't we move to a related question, and I'm going to ask Stephen Acabado to take this one first. Could you talk about the role of Southeast Asian archaeology to people who live in the US? So is there a benefit, I guess, to American students or the general public to having a higher visibility of Southeast Asian archaeology here? How would you make that argument?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone. Was actually just thinking about this a few days ago, because we're developing a program at UCLA in bringing Southeast Asian communities to UCLA to support our programs, to support our students, especially developing a program where the diaspora is able to learn about their heritage, learn about more recent archaeological and historical findings to strengthen their ethnic identity. That there are a lot of studies in psychology that suggest that immigrant youths, immigrant communities who are exposed to their parents or first generation heritage are more likely to succeed later in life, and also less incidences of suicide. And so as a person, also an immigrant person, I live both worlds. I work with heritage students, mainly Filipino heritage students at UCLA, and I see the issues that they have are very different from the issues that I have growing up. And the identity issue is something that always comes up, because they argue that, or they tell me that their parents never really exposed them to their parents' heritage. So at least in that sense, bringing Southeast Asia to the US, because a lot of them are probably are unable to visit Southeast Asia. A lot of them haven't been to the Philippines. So if we have all of these research projects that allow them to virtually and maybe later join us in our research projects, it's something that's formative, experiential, something that they will carry in their careers. Even if they don't go to archaeology or anthropology, it's something that will help them later in life.
Maybe I could, Keepal Heng, do you see something similar at UH or similarities, differences, compared to what Stephen's seeing at UCLA?
Yeah, I personally don't have that much of experience with outreach like Stephen has, but what I see the role of Southeast Asian archaeology in the US is that we can provide another comparative case studies to what have been done so far. Like we are familiar with to a certain degrees of case studies, for example, on early development of societies in East Asia, or to a certain degree on development in South Asia. But Southeast Asia, the region in between these areas is still, from my experience, I think it's still lacking. Like the previous panelists have mentioned, that we only have a few of us who looks at that. And from my own research, even trying to look at references to relate to similar case studies in Southeast Asia, it's still very rare. Like archaeology of religious change, or even archaeology of early state formation in Southeast Asia, it's still limited. But to go back to the questions on the advantage of having Southeast Asian archaeology related courses in Southeast Asia is that I think since the Americanist approach to anthropology is very broad and very comparative by nature, well, mostly American archaeology focuses on Mesoamerica. But I mean, since Michael Coe, he had brought up similarities with Angkor especially, and the tropical civilizations. So I would argue that case studies in Southeast Asia, regardless of urbanism, agriculture, development of early societies, will bring another perspective and understanding trends in development of human society as a whole.
Great, thank you. Miriam, do you want to go to the next question?
Sure. So we have divided this session into several blocks, an introductory block and a block thinking about US-based archaeologists working in Southeast Asia. But we wanted to move directly into how archaeology is practiced in Southeast Asia. And we want to ask really everyone, if possible, what some of their greatest challenges have been working in Southeast Asia as a US-based archaeologist. I wanted to start with Alison to give her a chance to talk, and then maybe some other people could volunteer.
Sure, thank you. I think the biggest challenge is honestly the distance. It takes a lot of time and money to get to Southeast Asia as a US-based archaeologist. It's not like some of my colleagues who can drive to their sites in the US or even in Mesoamerica. So there's a lot of extra logistical component, just kind of the really fundamental part of practicing archaeology is the access. And of course, the internet makes it so much easier for us to keep in touch with our colleagues now in a way that even when I first went to Cambodia for the first time in 2005, like it's exponentially better for keeping in touch with people and having an exchange of ideas and a dialogue, actually getting to go to Cambodia and raising the funds for it, and then doing field work always does take a lot of time and money. And of course, that's a challenge for us being based in the US. I would just mention, I think another challenge for US-based non-Southeast Asia people is language and access to language training. And I was really lucky that when I did my PhD at UW-Madison, that there were language opportunities through the SIASI program for Khmer. And then, and that's the Center for Southeast Asian Studies Summer Institute, SIASI, that does intensive Southeast Asian language training during the summers. And then also for certain languages could be taught during the year as well too. So having access to language training, I think also can be a challenge for people who don't have those resources and who really want to work in Southeast Asia, because I think that that's a really important, I'm sure this will be something will come up a little bit later in terms of decolonizing, is being able to communicate with our colleagues in their native language, have access to literature, even just the logistics of doing field work and being able to speak the local language, and not entirely relying on all of our colleagues being able to speak English in order for us to work with them. Is really important, but it is a challenge because language training seems to be getting harder and harder. Although now I'm really excited because I think through the Loose grant, there has been some expansion of online language training and distance learning opportunities for a lot of people. So my own PhD student is even doing distance learning here from Oregon at the NIU Khmer program. So that's a positive, really positive development, I would think. But those would be that's my 2 cents about this question.
Thanks, Alison. Nam, how about you coming into this from a different angle? And you also came in after a different career, right? So
Yeah, thank you. So I did embark on this journey a little bit later in life than might be typical for graduate students in archaeology. I was 30 when I started my graduate studies in anthropology and archaeology. So I'd done a few things before that. I think that one of the comments that Alison just made about logistics is very important because of the distance, because of all of the kinds of challenges that come with running an archaeological project. That can be extremely complex, especially when you have a lot of moving parts and different participants and partners. And we'll talk, I'm sure, more about partners later on. But in addition to language training, I think it's also cultural training that becomes very important, because you can learn the language, you can speak very well, you can communicate, but at the same time, you also have to learn to navigate the local environment, the local social environment, political environment. A lot of the work that many of us do draws interest from a variety of stakeholders. And because of that, there can be sensitivities that you have to kind of be aware of when doing work in a foreign country. So as a US-based researcher working in some of these countries, I think it's very important to be aware of local hierarchies that may exist. Sometimes they're communicated to you. Sometimes you have to learn on your own. And there are hints that are very subtle. But Miriam, to the point that you were making earlier about my previous career, I think a lot of the skills that I had developed in various positions prior to archaeology really translated and helped, because it allowed me to be entrepreneurial, but also to be aware of how to deal with different entities within these sorts of projects. So I think having the ability to recognize the importance of many relationships, regardless of who you're talking to at any given time, all of those communications are important. All of those relationships become very important, whether you can see it immediately or not.
Yeah, thanks. Can we turn to Ben, since he's worked in other countries than the ones we've been discussing?
Yeah, thanks. What Nam and Alison are saying definitely resonate deeply with me as well. And to that, I would add, what the challenges are sort of finding ways to satisfy everyone's priorities. So often I find I will come to work with my colleagues in Myanmar or Vietnam recently, and I have certain priorities. I know I want to find something, or got a certain kind of publication in mind, or talk I want to give. Their priorities are usually quite different, and they don't have this kind of cutthroat research intensive environment that they need to satisfy for tenure or promotion and so on. And so negotiating priorities so that everyone is satisfied, I find a real challenge. And especially, often the work habits are different, and routines are different from what we might be accustomed to. I think that this is the same as what Nam was saying about it's fine, it's okay to, it's one thing to know how to speak the language, but it's another thing to really understand the culture and the norms of another group. And so sort of accomplishing our shared goals, or firstly finding the goals that we share, and then making sure other goals are satisfied so that people feel it's a worthwhile thing to do together. I think it's a real challenge, and it takes me a long time to kind of work out, okay, these are the things I'd like to get done. What would you like to get done? And how can we make sure they get done as well while we're all here and we have these resources available to us? And that, sometimes can take a long time to establish a relationship where people can freely talk about, the things that have to be done for everyone to get satisfaction out of a collaboration. So that's a challenge I'm sort of still negotiating. I feel quite satisfied when it works out, but I know that there are still things that need to be, people could get more satisfaction, I think, out of the collaborations. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of language and someone growing up doing your research in the place where you grew up in, for you, I think you can just, for most of us, and if you don't speak the language, you can just pretend that you don't know the language, you don't know the culture. And for us, maybe for Vipal and I, sometimes it's hard because we know the culture, the politics, and we get embroiled in the politics within the community, the professional community. And it's hard for us to extricate ourselves in that kind of situation, because we're not from the outside looking in. We're also not from the inside looking out. So sometimes we don't know where we would place ourselves in this kinds of situation.
Yeah, it's almost like you're in the worst possible position, because I assume you're also probably held more accountable to your home community than foreigners might be. So there's that added pressure that you have to deliver later on.
I think it's so there's this movement or a methodological movement in anthropology to do the anthropology of the hometown, which Tata Dokot is doing, and several other anthropologists here in the United States. And it's hard because at least for cultural anthropologists, you write about your community, you write about your neighbors, and if you write negative about them, the same thing in archaeology. If you write something bad about the history, then there are consequences.
Yeah, I just would like to add just to the language part that Alison brought up, because if you track that back, I just happened to reread a 10th century inscription in Cambodia that talk about a temple and the rules applied to it. So one of that rule was that if an elite or elite families, men and women other than kings, on a palanquin with parasols and everything, it symbolized the status, go past this shrine, they have to exit the palanquin, the parasol have to take off. But it also specified that this rule does not apply to foreigners. So it's very specific, right? This is the 889, 890 CE inscription. And then when Joe Taquan visited Angkor in 1296, he also talked about that the Khmer in Angkor would say something akin to Manjes Piasa, not understand the language, so technically not understand culture. And that did not apply to the Chinese as well. So with us being a local archaeologists, all these will apply. Like we used to work with foreign archaeologists. I work with Medium since 2004. There are different rules. There are different subtle hints to what is appropriate and what is not. But then when I started my own project, that is a different story. We expect to go one way and then it came out the other way. So there's another learning curve for that.
Thank you. I imagine this might be a recurring theme, so let's keep this in mind, but I wanted to maybe ask a slightly different question here about asking each of you to share some of your best practices, stories from your own work or from work of other US-based colleagues that have helped define success for you. And anyone's welcome to start that.
This is tough, but I would like to jump in if that's okay.
Yes.
I will just say, I think, I don't know if I'm directly answering the question. I think it's really important as a foreigner working in Southeast Asia to go in and do work, or at least the best, I think the way you can be most successful is going in with good mentorship and with someone who has an established relationship. In the country, I think it would be really hard to go in without any relationship and try and build those kinds of relationships. Although I think Nam has done that a bit, and I'm sure he has some his own feedback on this. But for me, I think it's really successful. I feel like a lot of my success, and I've watched really successful projects because I've gone and worked with Miriam Stark, who's been a mentor to many of us. And watched how she, the kind of way that she carried herself, this kind of cultural stuff that we're talking about, the way she interacted with people, the way she mentored local scholars and worked with local people and was really so open to collaboration. And so I think having that infrastructure that Miriam provided is really important for a lot of people being successful, and having not just like going in, I mean, you can go in and do it on your own, but it takes a long time, but having someone who can model what that looks like is really important. And so I hope that as I continue to work with Miriam and now working with my own students, that I can that we can all kind of continue modeling what a good collaborative archaeology program is and how that evolves over time. I've learned a lot from some of the other panel members here and the work that they're doing too. So I think for me, best practices are not trying to do this by yourself, but really being collaborative, being open to hearing what people are saying and asking about and adjusting maybe your expectations, kind of like what Ben was talking about, like what are you trying to achieve versus what are local people trying to achieve as well too. So I think there's a lot of kind of intangible culture that goes along with doing archaeology that is relationship based, and having someone who has established relationships and then being able to work with them and see how they work is a great way to learn this kind of cultural know-how and the way that you can interact within whatever context you're working in. So that would be my way of starting this and kind of tying it into what we were just talking about as well too.
Am I allowed to add something, Peter?
Yes.
So thank you. It's very nice to hear that, but I have to give credit to the person who mentored me. I was very fortunate in graduate school to work with someone named Bill Longacre, who had worked in the Philippines for 20 years by the time he brought us students. And he was a very rare archaeologist, an ethnoarchaeologist who believed in putting his students first and had very deep and long-lived relationships with people who were in his host communities. So I agree with Alison, it's very important, and there are people out there we can learn from. But I also want to add that the best mentors are people who also attend to what they're learning from their hosts at the time. So I've learned all along the way from my colleagues, particularly my Khmer colleagues, and I'm very indebted. Thanks.
And I'd just like to add my name to people who have a debt to Miriam, and also mention another scholar that we know, Joyce White, who is in a similar role to me in sort of mentoring my sort of early work in Thailand and Laos. And one of the things that she sort of impressed upon me that I would count as a best practice that I've tried to carry on is, as a specific action, is like getting in front of a group of school kids in the area where I happen to be doing the field work, and just showing them some of the things we found at the end of a season, some artifacts, and trying to tell them a story about what we're here for and what we're trying to do in a way that they can understand, and also their teachers can understand, so they can sort of use that in an ongoing way. And that's such a satisfying activity. It's a really nice way to conclude a field season, a campaign, and everyone is kind of involved, our in-country collaborators and people who are sort of local residents and so on. And obviously the kids will go home to their parents and talk a little bit about it. And that just seems like a nice way to communicate what we're finding and organize our own thoughts about how did we answer our question? What have we really found? In the brief kind of post-excavation work that you can do in the field, have we got enough of a story that we can sort of justify to at least an audience of school kids that this was all worthwhile, and helped also to dispel some suspicions that often pop up when we do field work about, oh, there are people hunting for gold, or they're sort of searching for something terrible, or an ill omen might follow. And so I feel that's a really nice best practice, one that I think I owe a debt to Joyce. And it's not, I thought it was just a thing that everyone did, but I now know that it isn't, because it costs time. Like, it can cost you a couple of days in the field to organize this and go to the school, or more than one school. And many people feel that's not worth it. They feel like time is money, and they're sort of paying people things, and they've got to get back to their lab and get their publications sorted out. But I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing, even if it doesn't directly allow speed up your publication rate. It certainly makes it easy to go back to those areas again. People will remember that engagement. So that's a best practice. And I feel it's not very scientific. It's not really strictly archaeological, but I think is something that I feel makes my work in the region more satisfying for me, and I think for the people I work with as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Nan, do you have something to add?
Yeah. So if I may, I would also like to be added to the list that owes a debt to Miriam Stark, as well as others.
Yes.
So echoing what Alison was saying, finding people who can serve as a sort of guide or mentor or model to work after. So even though I didn't have contacts in the United States who had been doing work in Vietnam, I had models who'd been doing work elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and I could rely on their expertise and wisdom. I'm thinking here in particular of Laura Junker, one of my supervisors at University of Illinois Chicago, and her work in the Philippines. She was a model for me, thinking about how to go into some of these environments and the kinds of questions to ask, the ways in which I needed to be attentive and to have patience, lots and lots of patience. I would also echo what Ben was saying in terms of best practices. I think a lot of the work that we do, when we first go in, when we're proposing our work to potential funders and we talk about the research we'd like to do, we don't spend as much time talking about what happens after that work gets done. And that's something that I've come to learn is quite significant. And it's sort of some of the intangibles that come with some of this work, where we think about the ways in which the work then gets represented to the public in these local places, the ways in which we need to engage that public, and how some of that research is disseminated. I think about how we have to be aware that much of our research, whether we want it to or not, will be represented to diverse audiences. And if we don't take the time to think about how we would like to craft those messages, somebody else might do it for us. And so I think it's very important that we are cognizant of some of those issues and work with our collaborators. Everything that we present in a publication for a specialist should also be complemented by presentations or workshops that we give to public audiences, whether it's school children or others within these local communities. And I would say the same thing is important, even in our home institutions and locations in the United States. And this goes back to an earlier set of questions regarding diaspora and Asian American identity in the United States. I think a lot of the work that we do can have an impact for people who have ancestry. Increasingly, there are more and more American citizens that hail from these places and see these histories as very, very important. So for all of these reasons, I think those kinds of best practices are very beneficial.
Thank you. Stephen, anything to add? Anything that hasn't been stated you want to add on in best practices realm?
I think for me, and most of you, and I'll add my name, of course, my advisor, and of course Tito Bill. So I wouldn't be here if I hadn't met Tito Bill and worked on Miriam's talk during a typhoon in the Philippines, and so because of that, she invited me to apply to the Hawaii program. But yes, I think for me, it's working with communities. We all work, even though I'm Filipino, I work in a different place. Now I work in Bicol, but still, the internal power dynamics that we need to be aware of, from someone from the outside, working with communities, and also working with our local counterparts. Sometimes there is this tension between our local collaborators and archaeologists from somewhere else, or in this case from the US, that our way or the highway isn't really going to work in this case. Well, I think at one point in my career, I was going that way. It's my way or the highway, but you learn from your mistakes, and you learn to work with people. And so again, having an older, I think, older mentor and a model that you can look up to helps. All of us go through the same, I mean, most of us probably go through the same phase, but in this case, archaeologists from the global north specifically needs to be more aware of our power dynamics, economic status, our access to resources. Our theoretical perspectives are probably different, so we need to have a discussion with our collaborators, our partners, on how we should interpret the archaeological record. And later, maybe when we talk about interpretation and incorporating indigenous and local epistemologies in our interpretations, we can talk more about this. But I think again, in my phase, in one phase of my career, that I wouldn't ask questions that are not answerable by data. But now I'm with my work with communities, I'm changing my perspectives.
Thank you. Miriam, you're muted. I'm going to turn
Sorry.
it back for you.
Sorry, thanks. That's a really important segue, both to talking about broader issues about how to decolonize Southeast Asian archaeology, which frequently we people who are not of Southeast Asian heritage think is our responsibility, but you're also pointing out that there are issues archaeologists in general, I think, need to attend to. The next question we had is, how do we enable and sustain collaboration most effectively, most ethically with our colleagues who are in Southeast Asia? And what are suggestions you have? What should we be considering? Who would like to talk about that first? Paul, can I ask you, put you on the hot spot?
Well, let me think this over. It's it's continuing from the previous comment about being US-based archaeologists. But so from my experience going through the Royal University of Fine Art in Phnom Penh, when the Faculty of Archaeology was funded by a UNESCO program to train students. So we had a lot of international professors. So we had historians, we had archaeologists. We also had multiple international collaborative projects. So one with the University of Hawaii, with Brian Griffin, and then Miriam. And we also had collaborative project with Tübingen, University of Tübingen in Germany, that created the Mammoth Archaeology Museum. So I would start from that one, because with Tübingen, what they did was created this home base in Cambodia, and they relied on Cambodian archaeologists, one of whom is Dr. Heng Supati, who is now rector of the Royal University of Fine Arts. So their job was to engage with communities, community outreach, engage with students, engage with elders, bring them over to the excavations, to the museum, talked about stone tools, talked about prehistoric circular earthwork. So the approach to communities through times, within just a few years, anytime the community's member have found something in their garden, like a stone axes, so they would bring them over to the museum. So my point here is a long-term relationship with the local communities. The Lower Mekong Archaeological Project with Miriam's also following that trend that through times since the project started in 1995. So the series of fieldwork collaborated, LOMAPS collaborated with, continue to collaborate with RUFA, with the Royal University of Fine Arts, bringing students to the field, stay in the same place at the Acabado district office. And we know the people. So through time, there's this relationship being established that the communities know us. And so that, in a sense, that's established a gateway into the communities. But I'm not saying that everything works smoothly from that, because it has to do with socio-political context. Things changed drastically when I started archaeology at RUFA and now, because when I started, the first year we had a field trip visit was to Acabado. That was 1997, and so you hear from archaeologists, you hear from Miriam, you hear from other Khmer archaeologists, senior students who were there, talk about the project. That was all good. And then when you go out to the village, then you hear competing stories, right? One is that, following the spiritual line that this area should not be touched. It has, spiritual powers and things like that. The other competing story has to do with lootings, because it's the 80s, or actually since the Civil War started in the 70s, a lot of sites were looted. So in people's mind, archaeologists and looters, they one and the same, because nobody just go around and looking for stuff, right? It has to have monetary value, and then you have to deal with that. So what are you looking for? How are you gonna loot it? Can we share the revenue? All this kind of thing. So when the best practice here that I've seen working with other projects as well, both Cambodians and international projects, is our workmen. So we always employ workmen in our excavation and survey. And those workmen who are interested in the project tend to stay longer. They will return multiple times because they are interested. And they generally carry and digest our information, the archaeological purpose, the results and everything. They digest that, and then they convey that to their villages, to their peers. And it's more simplistic. It's easy to understand than for example, I were to do it. So I think that's one good practice that we've been doing. And another thing that I realized is that because the socio-political context in Cambodia changed so much over the past 20 years, now I have to rely on my junior archaeologists to go out and do outreach, because for the most part, what I had experienced going through various archaeological projects in Cambodia, learning about history in class, in school, it's not the same as what they experience today. So their approach to outreach, the way they talk to school children, the way they interact with the communities is totally different. And I find that effective. And the best way to that we learn even with also from the low map project with Medium is that you have to have at least 2 people, especially the project director, and another helper would have to go out and do community outreach, just talk to people. That means those 2 will be on your payroll, but they don't do archaeology. That has to happen, because then when people want to talk to us as archaeologists, we have a time frame, limited time frame. We have to justify the amount of time we spend on the data, the amount of data we collected for our funders. But in the field, it's different. People want to talk, and the way they talk, they want to know like what you do this for, and what's the reason behind it, what are you going to do with it, where you come from, what's it like over there, to establish this kind of personal relationship, and you have to stay and talk. So that has been the best practice to do it. Just have 1 or 2 people just talk to villagers or whoever coming and visit us at the excavation, and we'll just like, you talk, and others will carry on. So that just I think it's the best way to do community outreach. And my last point to that, on top of that, is school children. So far, I was involved with heritage education in primary school, junior high school, and high school over the past 20 years now. But but reaching out to this group of students, they have different interpretation of what archaeology is than their parents or grandparents. And they would convey that information to them in a way that we could not do it. And so far, the projects I've heard that have done that has been successful in conveying archaeological information to the local communities. So thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Now I can't resist calling on Peter Lathe, even though he's a moderator, because he's done just wonderful work in Eastern Indonesia. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about it to give a different perspective of someone who's clearly from the outside, but the kind of engagement that you've been doing since the beginning of your work there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm humbled by all these other panelists and the amazing projects that they do. I really feel like I didn't have a great mentor for that aspect of doing archaeology, of engaging with communities. I kind of made it up on my own, and probably made a lot of mistakes. But what I did in my dissertation period, and it was really driven by community members coming up to me and saying, "What are you doing? And are you stealing our gold?" Or all the things we've said. So I made friends with a local high school teacher and got him interested, and which was easy. And I'm still friends with him to this day, 25 years later, and got him to assemble a group of 10 students, and we did a museum exhibit that was very low budget and low tech, but really amazing. I mean, I got much more out of it probably than the students did, but I just loved working with these high school kids, and it changed my whole approach to archaeology by working with them. They taught me so much about their kind of preconceived notions of what archaeology was and what history was, and even time and kind of big concepts that we struggle with. So that set the stage for me that I just wanted to do that in every project. And like Ben mentioned, it does take time and money to do these things, but I started to build it into my grant proposals. And I think it's become much more standard to do that now, not because of anything I did, just because it's a good thing to do. And I think archaeologists have started to recognize that it's actually essential if we want to keep doing what we're doing, that we bring communities along with us. Yeah, honestly, it's been my favorite part of the job, has been working with communities along the way. So thanks.
Can I just ask Ben also, since you've also published on this recently?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I have 3 points about this question of how to sustain collaboration. I think the first one, to continue the theme about understanding the priorities of our counterparts in Southeast Asian countries, because often, my experience especially in Vietnam and Myanmar recently, the direct collaborators I work with, they are not university professors like me. They work for a government, like a federal government department, and are a civil servant, and their priorities and goals are quite different from mine. And so part of having a sustainable collaboration is me learning what theirs are, what their goals and priorities are, and finding ways to support them in the things that I do, because because of the nature of our career paths, we don't naturally kind of assume that we share them. And there's two other points that relate to this general idea of kind of countering the kind of extractive nature of archaeology. So, obviously archaeology, we survey things, we pick things up off the ground, we dig things out of the ground, and we take them out and extract, and then we measure them and extract data and so on. And I think we need to be quite deliberate about sort of undoing that extractiveness. And in disciplines beyond archaeology, generally, there's the concept of open science, which is the idea of making, the materials, the data that we collect, the measurements that we make of artifacts, making them available to other members of the research community and maybe even the public generally. And I think this is quite relevant to sustaining collaboration in Southeast Asia, because many Southeast Asian archaeologists are accustomed to foreigners coming in, digging stuff up, taking all those artifacts out, taking all the measurements, publishing their papers, and then nothing comes back. This is changing a bit with repatriation of artifacts and so on. But I still think we're not quite there yet with the data that we collect, and the Excel spreadsheets and so on, and the photographs that we take in the field. One way that we can support collaboration is to make sure those can get back into the hands of our local collaborators, and not just the people. I mean, it's one thing to email a spreadsheet back to the people that we work with, but also available to people like, high school teachers, like in Northern Vietnam where I work, for example. They may want to construct like an assignment for students that could use, a spreadsheet of stone artifact data that I've measured with my colleagues there. So make openly available to the public the archaeological data that we extract and collect for our research. And so I think this sort of concept of open science is important for sustaining collaboration. And as the final point is relating to this sort of broad field of open science is open access. And so this is making our written work, our book chapters, our journal articles, even this technical work that maybe is most appreciated by our peers, but also I think useful for the public to see. I think we have an obligation to make that available to anyone without any kind of financial barrier. So you may know, we write and publish journal articles. We don't receive any money for that, aside from our regular salary as university professors. But in order for the average person outside of university to read that, they have to pay per article. I think it's sometimes like $30 or $40, or have a subscription to the journal. Most of our colleagues in Southeast Asia don't. It's not an affordable way for them to access the literature. So it's our duty to make sure they can access what we write without any financial barrier. Unfortunately, there are lots of good options, free services for making available, for example, preprints or postprints of our paper, because making an open access article can be quite expensive to the readers, and many of you will know it can be $3,000 or $4,000. You might have to pay the journal to make it open access. And there are ways of making it open access without that high cost to either us as the author or the reader. I think these are considerations that we need to take more and more seriously as we sort of think about the future of sustaining collaborations with, especially where there's such an asymmetry in sort of resources for supporting research and teaching. So there's a few thoughts on that. Thanks.
I might ask Nan to weigh in as someone else who's worked in Vietnam on this question of working with collaborators. I want to actually bring up that the word collaborator has positive and negative connotations in English, and particularly in war situations where sometimes collaborators are seen, collaborating with the enemy. But I'm just curious, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you manage your collaborations in Vietnam. And Grace Breto Tesoro has raised in the Q&A a kind of related question about, what Ben talked about, these kind of differences or different needs or different goals in projects.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much to unpack in all of the previous comments. I would echo a lot of what was just said. When it comes to collaboration, Peter, you're right. There are positive and negative connotations, obviously. I think trust and time are very important. So being invested, I think one of the things that I noticed is when I first started working or exploring the possibility of working in Vietnam, there was a lot of skepticism. Is this person who was a graduate student from a foreign country, is this person coming back? Is this person able to actually get this project going? We've seen this sort of movie before and it didn't always end well. And so it takes time for that kind of mutual respect to result. Like some of the earlier comments, I often was asked, why are you doing this? What's your financial gain from participating in something like this? And it was hard for me to convince people that this was part of my graduate studies and that I was not being paid to carry out this work, that I was not going, most likely I wasn't going to be making very much money in the long run anyway with this chosen profession. But I think that was something that had to come with time. And what Ben was just saying in terms of this idea of open science and open access, I think is extremely important to consider as well. I remember when I first started field work with my local colleagues, the conservation center that is in charge of taking care of and managing the cultural property of Goloa, they asked me if one day when all of this was done, if I'd be willing to write a book and publish our findings free of charge. And as a graduate student, I was thinking, I don't know if I'll ever write anything. But I sure, if it ever gets to that point, I made a promise, I will do my best to make that happen. I'm happy and honored to say that finally happened just a few years ago. So we finally got that book published, and it's available free of charge for people in Vietnam. The Conservation Agency made this happen. And to me, it's one of the proudest achievements that I've been able to accomplish. Is this going back to this idea of making that science available and accessible. So it's not just the materials, the artifacts, the sites, it's also the knowledge that's produced around those, that archaeological record. That book is published in English and in Vietnamese. So those sorts of practices, I think, are very important when it comes to this sort of collaboration, when it comes to this idea of building local capacities and enabling and bringing resources to places that might not have access to all of those sorts of resources.
Really interesting. You know, I tell my students who are considering working in a Southeast Asian country that it's a lifetime commitment. You never satisfy your obligation to these people once you start these projects, and that's daunting, but I've come to realize that's true. Alison is someone maybe the most junior of the group here on the Zoom call. What's your experience working with collaborators or colleagues in Southeast Asia?
Thanks. I think actually a lot of what Paul brought up was really resonating for me, of course, since we both work in Cambodia and work together in Cambodia, that working with collaborators in Southeast Asia and in Cambodia, that word encompasses many different groups of people who actually might have really distinct and maybe even divergent interests in the past. So working with from like the local villagers where we're doing our research and the workmen to maybe like junior RUFA, Royal University of Fine Arts archaeology students to maybe like kind of junior Ministry of Culture people, then to higher up Ministry of Culture people. I think all of these are all collaborators on different levels, and they all at different points might have different interests in our research and our project, and navigating that as both a foreigner and as Paul was mentioning as a Cambodian can be sometimes a little bit tricky, and maybe there's different audiences that that we're trying to work with. I think overall I found, because I think I've come in working with Miriam Stark and with people who've established good relationships, I've had a really positive experience working in Cambodia with different collaborators. But now that we're working in a new place and kind of establishing new relationships. I think it's really interesting that I think like the questions that the local villagers have about our site are actually pretty different from like what maybe some higher up people in the Ministry of Culture would have, and the interest that they would like, the kind of research and data that they would want us to produce. And it's not necessarily even that they're contrary to one another, but they're just kind of different. And so working amongst these different groups is just another consideration to take into account. I would say it's a challenge, but it's not prohibitive or even negative to have these different stakeholder groups. That's all I have.
Thank you. Really interesting. Miriam, I'm wondering, should we move to another question? Okay.
We only have 5 minutes left before we're supposed to go to Q&A, and we have the biggest, most expansive question to ask of you now, which is where you see the future of Southeast Asian archaeology going globally, both if you're willing to predict what you think might happen, or if you'd like to talk about what you would like to see happen. You know, it would be helpful to get some insights. And anyone could start.
Yeah, I can start. A couple of just 3 thoughts, I guess, based on my sort of research activities. You know, in North American archaeology, a lot of interest recently on colonial and post-colonial archaeology and theory and so on. And I actually think that Southeast Asia is kind of a sleeper giant on this topic, because there's so many diverse forms of colonial interactions preserved in the archaeological record: Japanese, Chinese, European, sometimes simultaneously or in rapid succession in a small area. So there's a lot, I think, that I think the future of Southeast archaeology will have a sort of surprise relevance in the archaeology of colonialism, which was sort of dominating the many Western archaeological communities. I think there's a lot of unrealized potential that will make Southeast Asian archaeology relevant globally in the future. And then I think perhaps more sort of central to my own research is like the global stories of human evolution and dispersals, you know, out of Africa and to other parts. There's so many sort of surprise, what were surprise fossil finds. And there was a question earlier in the Q&A about DNA and how that's contributing surprisingly well-preserved pieces of DNA. And even the Humble Stone artifact is also sort of coming up with some interesting contributions to the global story. So what was previously, or I think for many archaeologists, is sort of thought of as a fairly uninteresting and not terribly active area of like Pleistocene Ice Age archaeology. I'm excited about future contributions to like the grand narratives of human evolution coming from the Southeast Asia region. And I think as we work to engage with the local research communities and just the local people there as well, we can sort of really speed some of this exciting future, especially through things like catalyzing meaningful collaborations. You know, they're often I know that in Myanmar, for example, I asked to organize a few meetings with a few scholars, and I thought, you know, I had heard their names, they might be useful, they might have some interesting information. And so we had a couple of pre-fieldwork seminars with a variety of scholars through Yangon, and it turned out a bunch of local people were meeting each other for the first time. And so I felt this was a really meaningful sort of catalytic event to stimulate, you know, a local research community. Evolving those experts early on in my project could enable them to make to build capacity after I left and involve their students with other researchers there, and really strengthen an environment for local research that can sort of have a sustainable future for decades after I'm no longer involved there. So those are some sort of thoughts about my future. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Dr. Acabado.
Thank you. Ben bit me to archaeology of colonialism. Hey, that's my work. Thanks, Ben. But you set up that idea that Southeast Asia really plays a big role in our world history, deep and more recent history. But we're not part of. I can count maybe 2 archaeology textbooks that use Southeast Asia as an example for some of their those boxes, and only Angkor focused on more exotic, more complex social organization. But I think Southeast Asia will play a part in transdisciplinary research that will redefine what is archaeology when we focus on the early modern period. That's how I'm bringing in the goal of the loose PEMSEA program, where we bring in paleoclimatologists, environmental historians, economic historians, and archaeologists, and the communities to understand what happened in the last 500, 600 years. I think we're not late. It's just that Southeast Asia wasn't. It's not part of the worldview of most of our colleagues. I had a hard time defining or explaining where Southeast Asia is, or what is Southeast Asian archaeology to my colleagues, because we're dwarfed by South and East Asian archaeologists, and there's really nothing that would define in a single word Southeast Asian archaeology. But the diversity of Southeast Asia, both culturally and historically and environmentally, would give us this entryway in bringing archaeology to the wider global archaeological tradition. I think so. The transdisciplinary research, I think a lot of us are doing that now. And for me, bringing in indigenous epistemologies and community stories into how we interpret the data. Yes, we have our own biases. But we use data, we use statistics, but we can always work with communities in coming up with a narrative that's more meaningful. Of course, we won't probably agree on something that's egregious, but the discussion itself, presenting the data, asking the communities to provide you with their perspectives is a good first step. And so I think it's developing a more meaningful archaeological interpretation through indigenous and local epistemologies. And lastly, as I mentioned before, as someone who's based in Southern California, in Los Angeles, the city in the world with the largest Southeast Asian community outside of Southeast Asia, I think it's something that we need to engage and bring our Southeast Asian students, not just maybe not even the communities first, but provide the space for Southeast Asian students to talk about their heritage. When we teach, when we offer courses in Southeast Asia, sometimes we don't really care because it's a requirement to teach. But based on my interactions with Southeast Asian students, especially when I taught Southeast Asian archaeology, and a Vietnamese student approached me and said, "Oh, I'd never learned about the archaeology of Vietnam from my parents. So thank you for offering that class." And so that's something that we don't think about, but I guess with more of us teaching Southeast Asian content, it will help with their identity.
Let me add to our previous panelists on these issues. I think that starting from Ben about colonialism, the study of colonialism in Southeast Asia, it's not just that. Like we can, Southeast Asia offer more potential in studying that, not just colonialism, but also interactions between different regions. Because I mean, we started from Indianizations, right, back in the 60s to talk about interactions between Southeast Asia or South Asia, and then some even talk about interaction between Southeast Asia and East Asia through the Vietnamese example. But in terms of of talking about how things change through times, which is our specialist. We could provide an in-depth perspective on how local Southeast Asian incorporate different worldview, different experience from interacting with this multiple international actors from South or East Asia to the European colonialist in the early modern period. So we could track change through times. Our historians have done a great deal of publications on these issues, but archaeologists still have to catch up with that. I mean, Stephen talked about Onco, but in Onco, most studies are dominated by historian and art historians, not archaeologists. And so there are a lot that we could contribute to all of these issues. Also in terms of ecology, Stephen talked about, like the field these days have dominated by political ecology, but as archaeologists, we could offer a much broader and long-term perspective how things change, human environment interactions, that could be a rich ground for future research in Southeast Asia as well. Thank you.
If I may jump in here, just to add to what my esteemed colleagues have been saying, there are a couple of terms that came up that I made note of because I thought they were very appropriate to center our conversation around. So Ben, I think you said grand narratives of humanity and how the region ought to be invoked and brought into these broader conversations. So you were talking about human evolution and peopling of the region during the Pleistocene. I'm working a little bit later on in time, but I'm thinking about these early formations of cities and kingdoms and states. As Stephen pointed out, when we do tend to see them, at least in the West, in textbooks for archaeology, when we talk about Southeast Asia, we see sites and histories from the Common Era. And there's this whole broad swath of history that seems to get glossed over. And I think that some of those sorts of cases ought to be invoked and added to these larger tapestries of humanity. Here, I'm going to plug shamelessly the work of Alison Carter and the incipient forms of globalization that we see that really use Southeast Asia as a very significant hub. So some of that work, I think, has to be added to these conversations. The idea about transdisciplinary approaches, I think, is also very important. And for me, one of the trends that I can see that it's already started, and I would say that this is something that we need to see more of moving forward, has to do with this sort of multinational collaboration, not just between the United States and countries in Southeast Asia, but between countries within Southeast Asia. Here, I'm thinking about a recent initiative that the UW-Madison and University of Hawaii embarked on, where we had students and researchers from various countries collaborating in Vietnam and in Cambodia, for instance, also supported by the Luce Foundation. But those sorts of bridges ought to be continued to be constructed. I'm also thinking about some of the conversations about colonization and colonialism, and even forms of colonialism in the past. That's something that I'm hoping to work on in the future in this theme of connecting countries. At the outset, I mentioned that I'm anticipating and hopeful that I will be starting to work in South Korea moving forward as well, to complement some of the work that I've been doing in Vietnam. For a very long time, Southeast Asia was viewed as a sort of passive recipient of civilization or high culture, as a backwater or appendage. I think that what we are starting to see now with our work shows that rather than being passive recipients, they're very active cultivators of various forms of cultural change. They are agents that are working very hard in their sorts of interaction with South Asia or East Asia. And one of the objectives I have with this work that's sort of cross-cultural and multinational in comparison is the kinds of interactions that happen between an emerging Sinitic civilization with parts of northern Southeast Asia, as well as the Korean Peninsula. And I'm hopeful that this sort of work will start to bring more players together across the region. And to me, that's sort of the kind of future I'm getting.
I just want to jump in and build on what Nam was saying. Everyone's brought up so many wonderful ideas, and I echo all of them. I really liked what Nam was just mentioning about having these cross-cultural kind of cohorts. I think that's another benefit of the SOAS program that's been bringing together lots of different Southeast Asian archaeologists into these great cohorts of people and being able to work across national boundaries. And I hope that's something that we can all continue to build on in the future. I think the one thing that I would add that hasn't been brought up yet is that this is from my perspective in Cambodia, although I suspect it's probably not that different in many other Southeast Asian countries, is that there's a bit of a leaky pipeline for female archaeologists, for women archaeologists, non-binary archaeologists. I think that there's a lot of familial pressures, at least that I see on my Cambodian female colleagues, for getting married and having a baby fairly young, or compared to where we are in the Western world, or at least in the United States. And I think that pulls them out of taking on more responsibility and more leadership positions. So I know we've gone through and had amazing female students from the Royal University of Fine Arts work with us on our projects, but they're often not able to continue their studies, go on for higher degrees, or once they do that, like kind of keep up with becoming a more full partner, collaborator, have opportunities to go overseas for degrees. So that's something that I would really like to see in the future, is that we have a bit more women join the field of Southeast Asian archaeology and stay.
Keeping my eyes on time here, we have time. I just want to remind all the attendees that please ask any questions. I think on Facebook, you can post those in the chat. And if you're on Zoom, you can put them in the Q&A link. There is one in there right now. Some of these have been answered in writing, but from Michelle Sabio, the question is, what would define the start of colonialism in mainland Southeast Asia? By the Chinese in Vietnam, et cetera, or by the Europeans? In Peru, for example, colonialism seems to start with the conquest of Incans in the Andean Cordillera. Does anyone want to take that on? Dr. Acabado, or?
Mainland Southeast Asianist.
Nam,
Yeah.
1,000 years.
Sure. I think that's an excellent observation. When we often talk about colonialism, often we think about more recent history, but of course, various states have existed in this part of the world for millennia, and some of their actions have had repercussions that resonate going back thousands of years. I mean, the example that I think, Michelle, that you mentioned is when we're talking about Vietnam. Of course, there was no Vietnam or China in the way that we know them and understand them today, 2,000 years ago. But we do know some of that history, and parts of imperial Chinese civilization began to move southward and elsewhere in various parts of Asia. And we can talk about annexation of the northern part of Vietnam, the Red River Delta and Valley area, and the sorts of reactions that resulted from that. I often am very interested in talking about the connections between politics, nationalism, and archaeology. We can see in the 20th century reactions in these sorts of post-colonial moments when we have new governments and regimes coming to power in Southeast Asia, freed from colonial foreign imposition. But those sorts of moments existed hundreds of years ago, and even a couple millennia ago. Resistance, opposition, and sorts of perceptions about history that get written and rewritten. That's been happening for a long time, not just in the last couple of decades or the last couple of centuries, but for a very, very long time. So I think it's an excellent observation to make.
Thanks. I'd add to the decolonization is a very hot topic in the US right now, and I think elsewhere. But most countries in Southeast Asia have already gone through the experience of decolonizing after World War II. And where the kind of the term originally came from, which was how do you dismantle a colonial apparatus in your country after you're no longer that colony. So I think there's a lot our colleagues in Southeast Asia can bring to the kind of the theoretical discussions of decolonization in archaeology and research that is maybe missing in the American discussion about this. Let's see, there's another question here in the Q&A. What's the current or near future state of field school opportunities in Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam, directed at Nam, given the COVID situation? And how have we all navigated the pandemic impact on research? And what, if anything, has been done to assist local collaborators? I know some of you have thwarted field school plans, Dr. Acabado, but yeah, I think anyone can jump in here. Great question. Nam, do you want to start?
I guess I should start since my name was mentioned. I have to be honest, I have not run a field school in Vietnam. And so I don't know that many opportunities, but I can certainly comment on how COVID has affected research, especially from my perspective, because I have been postponing research projects because of the health situation in Vietnam. I don't necessarily see an end in sight in the near term, simply because the situation, Vietnam was widely held up as a model for its policies and its reaction to the pandemic early on. But I think the situation has changed for the worse in more recent months. Because of the situation, I'm not sure when field work can happen for researchers from outside of Vietnam to come in. And from what I've understood from my colleagues, it's even difficult for local researchers to be traveling and to do field work at the moment. So because of all of these conditions and trends, it's difficult to answer that question. I don't know if others have other knowledge or experience that they may be able to add.
In terms of field school, part of the loose PEMSEA funding is to conduct field schools in the next 5 years. So depending on the COVID situation next year, we plan to run it in the Philippines, and then we'll be in Cambodia next, Thailand, Indonesia, and the 5th year we don't know yet. But for now, we're working on a schedule that we would be able to go next year, at least, well, if everything is okay with COVID. We're actually looking at field schools in Southeast Asia. It's very limited. So I've been running field schools since 2011 in the Philippines. And the last field school that I ran was in 2019. Most of the students are Southeast Asian heritage students or Filipino heritage students, for that matter, for my field schools. And a lot of them went through, looked for, just search for field schools and they didn't find anything, at least in my first few years of running field schools. But out of around maybe 50 alumni of the Ifugao Archaeological Project and the Bicol Archaeological Project, 26 of them went to graduate school, of 20 in anthropology, and about 5 for advanced graduate programs, public health, law, education. And so I think having this opportunity for it's not just a study abroad program, it's also learning your limits, living with total strangers for 4 or 5 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, you're friends. And the 3rd week, you hate everything that your roommates are doing. But if you survive your 3 weeks, you're probably friends for forever, or maybe enemies forever. But so a field school is something that molds you later in life.
I've had the field school plans postponed twice now. So I ran one in Vietnam, northern Vietnam a few years ago, which was so fantastic. And then had planned one for 2020 and the summer, and that was obviously postponed. And then also planned one for this summer, which was, 2019 and 2020. And then so the coming summer next year, I think is the one that hopefully we will have success organizing with. And my Vietnamese colleagues have been, their excavation and fieldwork schedule seems to be relatively uninterrupted. They're in the north, and the north of Vietnam has been much less affected until now, as Nam was saying, by COVID compared to the south. But so I hope to run a field school in the coming summer and invite you all to join me or visit, or in some way at least. All but warmly welcome. And about Josh's the follow-up question about the impact and assisting local collaborators, I just want to mention my collaborators in Myanmar, because they are having an unusually difficult time. And I, in fairly constant communication with some of them, just where are they and do they have enough food and so on. And ask, like, what can we do? What should we be doing, as people with some resources? And the main thing that they reply, I say, like, are there any NGOs I should know about that I could support or something like this? And they say, no, like, just keep in contact with us and be ready to re-engage when it's safe to travel, and follow up with the publications that we're working on. Keep us in mind and just keep us kind of as part of your normal kind of professional work. So, which to me is very, it's not really the reaction I was anticipating. I was expecting them to say, like, here's the charity or the NGO that really needs a lot of support, donate to that. But instead they're saying, like, just maintain our professional relationship and be ready to carry on where we left off when it's safe to return. So that's in terms of assistance, I think the best thing we can do is ask them and say, well, what's the best way we can support you? Because I was surprised at how they responded to that. And if I had just gone ahead and sort of written checks or whatever, that perhaps wouldn't have been the most useful thing I could do, or wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been very useful to my collaborators in particular. So anyway, see you all in Vietnam next summer.
I forgot to mention that the Loose PEMSEA Field School is fully funded. So if you're one of the lucky 8 undergraduate students, your airfare and field expenses are covered. So we're bringing 8 undergraduate students, 4 graduate students, and 4 early career Southeast Asia based archaeologists or historians, as now mentioned. This is pattern from Miriam's Loose Asian Archaeology program, where we actually hosted I think 4 or 5 Cambodians when we were running field schools. So wait for the we'll have our the details for the field school hopefully in the next 2 weeks.
So I'm looking to our organizers for a time check. There's a great question from Grace in the Q&A, but I don't know if we have time to take that on. Any advice? Shall we go for that one?
Maybe someone can answer the question. Oh, yeah, just one of us.
I'll read the question out while you're thinking about it. How do you deal with, if any, instances of opposition from locals and vice versa regarding interpretation, methods, theories, ethics, behavior? How do you avoid the locals feeling that you're imposing on them, particularly in countries that were colonized and have strong feelings against the West?
I will say just a short answer is to learn about the social values of archaeology that are recognized amongst the host community, and then do work that satisfies those values, even if it's orthogonal or even at odds with our original objectives. That's my short answer.
That's a good one. I was going to add that, I think there may be blanket opposition to the West in many places, increasing all the time. But I think we all find that at a personal basis or a one-to-one, you find commonalities with scholars and community members all the time that can transcend those bigger biases in both directions. So I think we've all found these kind of personal connections to scholars, community members, and others, and that actually is how our work happens through building those trust relationships.
Could I add one point there?
Yeah.
Only that I think we also need to know when to fold. I know people was on the field season where we had to make decisions not to work in communities in spite of layers of permissions. So I think you just have to be sensitive to the local sentiment. And in some cases, you'll find kind of like what Peter's saying, some people will support it and some won't. And you'll have to just sort of move carefully and decide whether it's worth it and consult. Consultation is everything. And archaeologists, we're usually raised as archaeologists to think our science is number one. I think one of the best lessons of working in Southeast Asia all these years is that it's not, and that making sure that the work is done in a welcoming place is the most important. So if people are not ready for the work, you have to wait, and maybe you won't work there. Because one thing I found in working many years in the same country is that there are many people who are interested in working with us if we approach them in the right way. And we just have to be patient.
Could I just add to that? I agree 100%. And to me, one of the other sorts of corollaries is not just seeking out people, but recognizing the diversity in those communities, because not everybody views themselves, their identities in the same ways. Not everybody connects to those histories in the same ways. And also in terms of representation, not everybody has access. Some groups are excluded. Some groups have their histories excluded or erased. And I think it's important for us to be aware and be sensitive to that. So sometimes they'll come to you, but sometimes you might have to seek out groups and ask, how would you like to participate? Would you like the opportunity to participate when maybe those opportunities might not exist?
Great point. Stephen, do you think we're at 8:58 by my clock?
Thank you. So I'll now put on my hat as the director of the program for early modern Southeast Asia, and thank everyone for attending our panel today. We have 2 more panels coming up in the next 2 weeks, and I'll call on Pearl to plug in our Women in Philippine Archaeology panel for next week.
Hi everyone, Diyos Marino ito po sa Indogabos. I'm Earl Hernandez from the Partido State University, Masay de Sarog. Thank you for joining Panel 6, The Future of Southeast Asian Archaeology in the US. I would like to thank our panelists and moderators for sharing your insights and experiences in doing Southeast Asian archaeology. For my personal take, I think from continued mentorship, we are seeing the community roles are vital in the future of Southeast Asian archaeology in the US. Please help us improve our upcoming webinars by providing us your evaluation. The link is provided at the Zoom chat box by Madieko, and also posted at the Facebook pages Museo de Isarog and UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. The digital certificate is auto-generated, so please check the email and name you will provide. For next week, September 20, California, September 21, Philippines. Please continue to join us as we talk about women in the Philippine archaeology panel. The panel is second to the last of this series. Follow us also on our official web page posted at the Zoom chat box. Diyos mabalos po.
Thank you, everyone. How do you turn off the recording?